Sarah Collins had fought the land for 3 years since burying her husband, but the mortgage notice clutched in her calloused hands finally confirmed what she'd feared. The battle was lost. Dawn light spilled through cracked windows, illuminating the cabin's worn but meticulously clean interior. Outside, her children Thomas and Emma tended chores, unaware that in 30 days, the only home they'd known would belong to the bank. The drought had withered their crops, just as grief had withered their prospects. Sarah touched the wedding ring hanging on a string around her neck. James Collins had promised her a life of security before pneumonia took him. Now his children would learn the harshest lesson of frontier life. Sometimes hard work wasn't enough. Unless a miracle arrived, they joined the growing ranks of displaced homesteaders. Thunder rolled in the distance as Sarah folded the notice. She wouldn't tell the children yet. First, she needed a plan, or at least enough courage to face them when the storm broke. What would you sacrifice to protect your family? Sarah Collins faces losing everything she and her late husband built: her home, her children's future, her independence. But sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. Have you ever had to swallow your pride to save what matters most? Share your thoughts in the comments, and like if you believe a mother's courage knows no limits. Subscribe for more tales of frontier strength, where hope blooms even in the harshest conditions. Because Morning Glory Ranch is about to show that sometimes the end of one dream is just the beginning of something greater. Sarah Collins had fought the land for 3 years since burying her husband, but the mortgage notice clutched in her calloused hands finally confirmed what she'd feared. The battle was lost. Dawn light spilled through cracked windows, illuminating the cabin's worn but meticulously clean interior. Outside, her children Thomas and Emma tended chores, unaware that in 30 days, the only home they'd known would belong to the bank. The drought had withered their crops just as grief had withered their prospects. Sarah pressed her fingertips against the table's rough surface, steadying herself. 3 years of rising before the sun, mending fences until her hands bled, stretching every penny until it screamed, and still they would lose everything. The bank's cold figures stared back at her, indifferent to human struggle. Through the window, she watched 14-year-old Thomas struggle with the broken plow, his shoulders already bearing a man's burden. Nearby, 12-year-old Emma gathered eggs with the careful precision that characterized everything she did. Sarah had protected them from the worst truths: that their father had died owing more than they could ever repay, that each season had driven them deeper into debt despite her best efforts. "Ma!" Emma's voice startled her. Sarah quickly folded the notice and slipped it into her apron pocket. "Just finishing the accounts," she lied, forcing a smile. "How are the hens treating you today?" "6 eggs," Emma reported proudly, "and Thomas fixed the wheel on the cart." Sarah nodded, unable to tell her daughter that 6 eggs and a repaired cart wouldn't save them from what was coming. Instead, she stroked Emma's hair, so like her father's, and watched storm clouds gathering over the distant mountains. "Looks like we might get rain," Sarah said, grateful for any distraction. "Is that good or bad, Ma?" Emma asked, always perceptive. "Depends on whether it brings more than we bargained for." The first lightning strike illuminated the western ridge as Sarah secured the last shutter. Wind whipped her skirts, carrying the promise of rain that could either save their withering crops or wash them away entirely. Montana weather offered no middle ground. "Thomas, get the animals in," she called over the rising gale. Her son nodded grimly, already moving toward the small pasture where their remaining milk cow grazed with the 2 workhorses. Emma appeared at her side, clutching the precious burlap sack of seed corn they'd been saving. "Should I move this higher, Ma, in case of flooding?" Sarah nodded, impressed by her daughter's foresight. "Put it in the loft with the winter blankets." They couldn't afford to lose a single kernel if they hoped to plant next season, though what good seeds would do without land to plant them, she couldn't say. The first heavy drops splashed against the dirt as Sarah helped Thomas herd the animals into the barn. Lightning flashed again, closer now, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that made the horses stamp nervously. "This is going to be a bad one," Thomas said, his voice deeper than his father's had been at the same age. He secured the barn door with practiced efficiency, sliding the wooden bar into place. "Roof's leaking again over the corn bin." "We'll manage," Sarah replied, the phrase worn smooth from repetition, like your father always said, "Bend with the wind or break against it." Both children finished in unison, the familiar saying a touchstone connecting them to the man they'd lost. Thomas suddenly froze, peering through a crack in the barn siding. "Ma, there's something down by the creek." Sarah followed his gaze into the storm's fury. Lightning revealed a dark shape sprawled at the water's edge, too large for a coyote, too still for a deer. "It's a man," Emma whispered, "and I think he's hurt." Rain pounded against them as they reached the creek's edge. The stranger lay half submerged in the rising water, blood from his shoulder turning the stream a pale crimson. Sarah knelt beside him, heedless of the mud soaking her skirts. Her fingers found his neck, seeking a pulse. "He's alive," she announced, already examining the wound with practiced hands. "Gunshot. Clean through the shoulder, but he's lost a lot of blood." Thomas stood protectively between the stranger and Emma, his father's hunting knife gripped tightly. "Ma, he could be an outlaw. Men don't get shot for no reason." "Or he could be someone's victim," Sarah countered, tearing a strip from her petticoat to staunch the bleeding. "Emma, run back and get my medicine box. Thomas, help me move him before this creek rises any further." The man was large, dressed in quality clothing despite its current sodden state. A gentleman's coat, custom boots, not a drifter or common criminal. Sarah noted the calluses on his hands, contradicting his fine attire. A worker who'd come to money, perhaps, or money that wasn't afraid of work. "We can't just leave him, Ma," Emma insisted as Thomas hesitated. "The storm's getting worse." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the stranger's face. Strong features, a well-trimmed beard now matted with mud. Not young, but handsome in a weathered way that spoke of a life lived outdoors despite his fine clothes. Sarah estimated him to be about 40, her husband's age, had James lived. "If we bring him home, his trouble becomes ours," Thomas warned, voicing the fear Sarah herself felt. The wounded man groaned, stirring slightly. Blood seeped through Sarah's makeshift bandage, washing away in the rain. She made her decision, knowing it might be one she'd regret. It already has. "Help me lift him." James Harrison's eyes snapped open, hand instinctively reaching for a gun that wasn't there. Pain lanced through his shoulder, forcing a sharp intake of breath that drew the attention of the woman crushing herbs at a nearby table. "Your pistol's under the bed," she said calmly, not looking up from her work. "Unloaded. My son's idea." James assessed his surroundings. Small cabin, meticulously clean despite obvious poverty. His shoulder had been professionally bandaged, his clothes replaced with a simple cotton shirt too small across his chest. Outside, rain still pounded against the roof. "How long?" he managed, voice rough from disuse. 2 days. Now she did look at him, eyes direct and assessing. "Fever broke last night. I wasn't certain you'd wake with your wits intact." A young girl appeared in the doorway, face brightening when she saw him conscious. "Ma, he's awake. Should I tell Thomas?" "Yes, Emma." The woman added her crushed herbs to a steaming cup. "Your name, sir, while you're feeling cooperative?" "James Harrison." He accepted the cup she offered, noting the practiced efficiency of her movements. "And you've saved my life, Mrs. Collins." "Sarah Collins." She nodded toward the door where the girl had disappeared. "That was Emma. Thomas is my son. They helped pull you from the creek before you drowned." James sipped the bitter tea, recognizing willow bark and other medicinal herbs. "You have skill with medicine." "My grandmother was a healer. Necessary knowledge out here." She studied him with frank curiosity. "Most men shot in these parts are running from something or someone." "Sometimes both," James admitted, attempting to sit up further. Pain flared again, but he managed to maintain his composure. Emma returned with a tall, wary boy who planted himself protectively near his mother, hand resting casually near a knife at his belt. "I'm Emma," the girl offered brightly. "That's Thomas. He doesn't trust you yet." "Smart boy," James replied with a slight smile, then turned to Sarah. "And you're Sarah Collins." "I've heard of this homestead." Morning light filtered through the cabin's windows, the storm having passed during the night. Sarah placed a mug of coffee before James, who now sat at their table, shoulder bandaged, but color returned to his face. "You said you'd heard of our homestead," Sarah prompted, pouring coffee for herself. "I can't imagine how. We're hardly noteworthy." James cradled the mug in his hands, considering his words carefully. "I own Eagle Ridge Ranch, west of here. Been looking to expand water access to my south pastures." Thomas, who had been whittling by the fire, looked up sharply. "Eagle Ridge? That's the big spread by the mountains. That would make you a man with resources," Sarah finished, reassessing their guest. "And enemies, judging by that bullet hole." James nodded grimly. "Marcus Blackwood and I have differing views on water access rights." "Blackwood?" Sarah's knuckles whitened around her cup. "The cattle baron buying up half the valley?" "The same. His men tried to make our disagreement permanent the other day." James shifted uncomfortably, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "I was surveying the creek that runs along your property when they found me." Emma, who had been quietly listening while mending a shirt, spoke up. "Is Mr. Blackwood why so many families have had to leave their farms?" James met the girl's innocent question with surprising directness. "Yes, he wants to control all the water in the valley. Whoever controls water controls everything else." Sarah studied James with new wariness. "And what's your interest in our creek, Mr. Harrison?" "Fair access for all landowners," he replied evenly. "Unlike Blackwood, I believe there's enough for everyone if managed properly." Thomas snorted skeptically, but before James could respond, Emma gasped, pointing through the window. "Ma, riders coming!" 4 of them. James instinctively reached for a gun that wasn't there. "Blackwood's men, they're tracking me." Sarah moved with calm efficiency, helping James to his feet. "Thomas, take Mr. Harrison to the root cellar. Emma, get his bloody clothes out of sight." She watched her children respond without question, Thomas supporting the larger man despite his obvious reluctance. The root cellar trapdoor closed just as the sound of hooves grew louder in the yard. Sarah straightened her apron, pinched color into her cheeks, and stepped onto the porch as 4 riders approached. Their leader, a hard-faced man with a star pinned to his vest, tipped his hat with false courtesy. "Morning, ma'am. Name's Jennings. Work for Mr. Blackwood as security. We're looking for a wounded man, might have passed this way." Sarah crossed her arms, expression neutral. Nobody passes here much, especially in weather like last night's. Jennings dismounted, eyes scanning the yard. Mind if we look around? For your safety, of course. Man we're after is dangerous. My children and I manage our safety fine, thank you. Sarah didn't move from the porch steps, blocking their path to the house. Another rider pointed toward dark stains on the porch boards. That looks recent. Thomas appeared at Sarah's side, his young face impressively blank. Shot a coyote after it took one of our chickens. Emma emerged holding feathers as evidence. My favorite one, too. Jennings' eyes narrowed, but uncertainty crossed his face. Well, Mr. Blackwood would appreciate knowing if you see any strangers. Man we're after owes him considerable money. We'll keep that in mind, Sarah replied evenly, not moving until the riders finally turned their horses and rode away. When they were safely out of sight, she helped James from the cellar, her hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. "Thank you," he said quietly. Sarah merely nodded, then froze as she noticed an envelope that had been left on the porch railing. Inside was a bank receipt, her mortgage marked "Paid in full." Sarah clutched the mortgage receipt in one hand and the cabin's door frame in the other, steadying herself against the morning sun and the impossible document that threatened her view of the world. When James emerged from the cabin behind her, she turned abruptly, thrusting the paper toward him. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice tight with pride. James regarded the receipt with a slight nod. "It's not charity, it's investment." "In what, exactly?" Sarah demanded, painfully aware of her children watching from the porch. "Strategic location, good water, timber." His eyes met hers directly, and frankly competent management. Sarah stiffened. "You don't know anything about my management. I know you've kept this place running 3 years alone." James gestured toward the neatly maintained homestead, modest but orderly despite its obvious challenges. "That tells me enough." The wind caught Sarah's hair, blowing a strand across her face. She tucked it away with a hand that refused to tremble. "And what do you get from this investment?" "A buffer between my land and Blackwood's." James stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And perhaps a partner." Sarah studied him, searching for deception in his steady gaze. "Partners have equal say, Mr. Harrison. I won't be beholden to any man." "I wouldn't expect otherwise, Mrs. Collins." He extended his hand, formal despite his bandaged shoulder and borrowed clothes. "Your land remains yours. I'm proposing we work together to improve it, starting with repairs to your barn and northern fencing." Thomas had drawn near enough to hear. "Why would someone like you care about our homestead?" "Because your mother saved my life," James answered simply. "And because Blackwood wants both our properties enough to kill for them." Sarah hesitated, then took James's offered hand. Her grip was firm, her decision made. "We have an agreement, Mr. Harrison. God help us both." A week later, the homestead hummed with activity. Lumber wagons from Eagle Ridge Ranch had delivered materials that Thomas and James now used to rebuild the corral. Despite his healing shoulder, James worked alongside the boy, demonstrating an improved fencing technique. "The trick is setting the post at this angle," James explained, showing Thomas how to brace the upright against Montana's notorious winter winds. Thomas eyed the work skeptically. "Pa always set them straight." "Your pa didn't have the advantage of Montana winters teaching him." "Try it." Thomas reluctantly followed James's instruction, surprise registering on his face when the post held firmly with less effort than his usual method required. "It does hold better." "You've got a natural talent for this," James observed, handing the boy another post. Thomas shrugged, but his expression softened slightly. "Ma says I get it from my father." James nodded, carefully measuring his response. "He'd be proud of how you've looked after things." From the porch, Sarah watched the exchange with complex emotions playing across her face. New tools lay scattered around the yard, along with supplies she could never have afforded: nails, wire, hinges, fresh paint. Two young ranch hands from Eagle Ridge worked on the barn roof, replacing rotten boards that had leaked for years. Emma approached with a tray of lemonade, observing her mother's conflicted expression. "Thomas is starting to like Mr. Harrison," she noted. "Is he?" Sarah replied noncommittally. "You could too, Ma." Emma's directness caught Sarah off guard. "He's not trying to replace Pa. He's just trying to help." Sarah sighed, touching the wedding ring she still wore on a string around her neck. "It's not that simple, Emma." "Isn't it?" Emma asked, with a child's innocent wisdom. "You always say we should judge people by their actions, not their words." Sarah had no answer for that, as she watched James patiently teaching her son. The town of Gallatin Springs consisted of little more than a general store, church, schoolhouse, and sheriff's office clustered around a dusty main street. As Sarah and James tied their horses to the hitching post outside the general store, she noticed the immediate effect of their arrival together. Conversations halted, gazes followed them, whispers erupted in their wake. "You're causing quite a stir," Sarah murmured, uncomfortable with the attention. "We both are," James replied, tipping his hat politely to a passing woman who stared openly. Inside the store, the shopkeeper's eyes widened as they entered. "Mr. Harrison, didn't expect to see you in town so soon after your accident." "Just picking up supplies for the Collins homestead," James replied evenly. "We're partners now." The shopkeeper's gaze darted between them, clearly calculating the gossip value of this information. Before he could respond, the schoolteacher, Eleanor Whitman, approached with unusual boldness. "About time someone stood with Sarah," she declared, her gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "The school children miss Emma and Thomas. Will they be returning now that your situation has improved?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "They've been needed at home, Eleanor, but yes, they'll return soon." As James paid for quality supplies Sarah would never have afforded, she noticed a man watching them from the saloon across the street, one of Blackwood's men from the search party. His cold stare made her skin prickle. Sheriff Hayes appeared as they loaded their purchases, drawing them aside with a concerned expression. "Harrison, Blackwood knows you survived. He's not pleased about your new arrangement." "Is that a warning, Sheriff?" Sarah asked quietly. Hayes adjusted his hat nervously. "Let's call it friendly advice. Watch your backs. Blackwood's filed claims on water rights for half the streams in the valley, including yours." James and Sarah exchanged glances, unconsciously standing closer together. "We appreciate the information, Sheriff," James said. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as James and Sarah walked the creek that formed the eastern boundary of her property. James stopped occasionally to examine the soil and water flow, his expression growing more troubled with each observation. "Your creek feeds into the main river that waters most of the valley," he explained, kneeling to examine a series of wooden stakes hammered into the ground near the water's edge. "Someone's been surveying here recently." Sarah frowned, touching one of the stakes. "These weren't here last week." "Blackwood's men." James stood, scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. "They're mapping the watershed." Thomas and Emma had followed at a distance, keeping watch as they'd been instructed. Now Thomas approached, holding something he'd found half buried in mud. "They dropped this," he said, handing over a folded paper. James opened it carefully, revealing a detailed map with annotations. "It's a survey for a dam, right here at the narrowest point of the creek." Sarah studied the map, her stomach tightening. "That would cut off water to half the homesteads in the valley." "Including yours," James confirmed grimly. "And it would isolate my ranch from the river. Blackwood could charge whatever he wanted for water access, or deny it completely to force people off their land." Emma, who had been keeping lookout, suddenly tensed. "Someone's coming," she whispered. They crouched behind a stand of cottonwoods as two riders passed on the ridge above, Blackwood's distinctive black hat visible even at a distance. He gestured toward the creek, clearly explaining something to his companion. "He's moving faster than I expected," James said quietly. "The territorial government would never approve this dam. It violates too many existing water rights." "Since when has that stopped men like Blackwood?" Sarah asked bitterly. James's hand briefly touched her shoulder in reassurance. "We need allies, Sarah. This affects more than just us." "Who would stand against Blackwood?" she asked. "He owns half the territory." "Not yet," James replied, determination hardening his features. "Not yet." The Gallatin Springs meeting hall had never been so crowded. Nearly every homesteader, shopkeeper, and rancher from the surrounding valley had squeezed into the stuffy room, drawn by the announcement of Marcus Blackwood's water management proposal. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows across faces marked by equal measures of curiosity and apprehension. Sarah sat with James in the middle rows, uncomfortably aware of the glances directed their way. Emma and Thomas had been left at home despite their protests. This was no place for children, Sarah had insisted, though the real reason was her fear of what might unfold. Marcus Blackwood stood at the front of the room, resplendent in a tailored suit and gleaming boots. His silver hair and carefully trimmed beard gave him a distinguished appearance, belying the ruthlessness of his business practices. Sheriff Hayes stood nearby, ostensibly maintaining order, but clearly deferential to Blackwood's authority. "Friends and neighbors," Blackwood began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the room. "The future of this valley depends on proper water management. My engineers have developed a plan that will ensure stable water supply even during drought years." A weathered farmer near the front spoke up. "Meaning you controlling it, Blackwood?" Blackwood smiled thinly. "Meaning organized distribution through my new reservoir project. Progress requires investment and leadership, which I'm prepared to provide." He gestured to a large map unfurled on the table before him, pointing out the proposed dam site, exactly where James and Sarah had found the survey stakes. James rose to his feet, drawing all eyes. That project would conveniently dry out competing ranches and homesteads. It's not water management, it's water theft. Blackwood's smile never faltered, though his eyes hardened. "Mr. Harrison." "Recovered from your hunting accident, I see." Sarah stood beside James, her voice clear and steady. "Is that what we're calling attempted murder now?" A murmur rippled through the crowd as battle lines were silently drawn. Blackwood's composure never cracked, though the vein pulsing at his temple betrayed his anger. "Mrs. Collins, I understand your concern, but this is a matter for property owners with significant investments to discuss." "My mortgage is paid, Mr. Blackwood," Sarah replied evenly. "That makes me as much a property owner as anyone here." Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed. How fortunate for you, given your circumstances." His gaze shifted meaningfully toward James, though perhaps fortune had little to do with it. The insinuation hung in the air, causing Sarah's cheeks to flush. Before she could respond, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a solicitous tone. "Mrs. Collins, how are your children?" Such a dangerous season for young ones, especially when their mother involves herself in contentious matters. Sarah stepped forward, hands trembling slightly, but voice steady. "Are you threatening my family, Mr. Blackwood?" "Merely expressing concern," he replied smoothly. "Children need stability, protection." "They have both," James interjected, moving protectively closer to Sarah. Blackwood turned to address the room, arms spread in a gesture of magnanimity. "This valley prospers under my investments. The railroad will reach us within 2 years, but only if we present a united, progressive community to investors. Anyone standing with the widow and her gunshot paramour stands against progress itself." "Progress?" Sarah's voice cut through the murmurs. "Is that what you call stealing water rights from families who've worked this land for years? My husband and I came here when this valley was nothing but promise. We built our home with our own hands, survived winters that would freeze the marrow in your bones, Mr. Blackwood." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "We buried our dreams and our dead in this soil. You may call it progress to drive us out, but I call it theft, dressed up in fine words and surveyor's maps." The room fell silent, the lines of conflict now clearly drawn. The silence stretched taut until Eleanor Whitman rose from her seat near the front, her thin frame seeming to grow taller with resolve. "The school needs water too, Mr. Blackwood," she stated firmly. "Or do children's needs not factor into your progress?" Blackwood's smile became strained. "Miss Whitman, the reservoir would provide ample water for the town." "At what price?" interrupted Liam Chen, the shopkeeper, standing at the back of the room. His Chinese accent was barely noticeable after 15 years in Montana Territory. "My family came here for fair opportunity, not to trade one emperor for another." Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Consider carefully, friends. Prosperity requires loyalty." "We're loyal to our neighbors, Blackwood," called out Farmer Johnson, his weathered face set in stubborn lines. "Always have been." One by one, several more homesteaders and small ranchers stood, aligning themselves with Sarah and James. Not a majority of those present, but enough to be significant. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mixed with disbelief at this unexpected support. "Seems the community has opinions on your dam, Blackwood," James observed, the challenge evident in his voice. Blackwood surveyed the room, his controlled exterior showing the first cracks of genuine rage. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a cold, quiet tone more frightening than any shout. "Opinions change when reality sets in. Remember that." He gathered his maps with deliberate care. "This meeting is adjourned. Sheriff, please escort me to my carriage." Sheriff Hayes looked uncomfortable but complied, following Blackwood from the hall. The remaining crowd broke into clusters of intense conversation. Eleanor approached Sarah, clasping her hands warmly. "You spoke well, my dear. It's about time someone did." "Thank you," Sarah replied, still stunned by the support. "Though I fear we've all painted targets on our backs. Some things are worth standing for," Eleanor said simply. Outside the meeting hall, dusk had fallen, casting long shadows across the town. James and Sarah were discussing next steps with their new allies when Emma and Thomas burst through the crowd, breathless from running. "You were supposed to stay home," Sarah admonished, though relief at seeing them safe overwhelmed her anger. "We found something," Thomas said urgently, ignoring her rebuke. "After you left, we decided to check the creek again." "They're already cutting trees, Ma." James stiffened. "Blackwood's moving ahead, regardless of the meeting." Thomas pulled a folded paper from his pocket, handing it to James. "They dropped this. It's different from the other map." James examined the document, his expression darkening. These are construction orders dated yesterday. He's already hired men and ordered materials. Sarah looked over his shoulder at the paper. The meeting was just for show. He's already building the dam. We followed them upstream, Emma added. They've marked dozens of trees for cutting. James looked at her sharply. You followed Blackwood's men. That was dangerous. We were careful, Thomas insisted, standing taller. They never saw us. James spread the plans on a nearby barrel, where Eleanor and Liam Chen leaned in to examine them. This isn't just a dam, James said grimly. It's a complete diversion. He's planning to redirect the entire creek flow to his property. Sheriff Hayes approached cautiously, eyeing the gathered group. I'd advise you folks to disperse. Blackwood's in a dangerous mood. Sheriff, look at this, James said, showing him the construction orders. This is illegal. He's proceeding without approval from the Territorial Water Commission. Hayes studied the documents, his face troubled. I can delay him with paperwork, maybe send a telegram to the territorial office, but he glanced over his shoulder nervously. Blackwood owns the judge. Any official response will take weeks, if it comes at all. We don't have weeks, Sarah said, looking at her allies. If that dam goes up, our lands die of thirst. Then we stop it, Farmer Johnson said grimly. Together. Dawn revealed the full extent of the night's destruction. Sarah stood in the yard, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill, surveying the smoldering ruins of their barn. The structure that had withstood 15 Montana winters was now little more than charred timbers and ash. Inside the cabin, James lay on Sarah's bed, his shoulder wound reopened during the frantic efforts to save the livestock. Emma moved quietly beside him, changing bandages under her mother's instructions, while Thomas kept watch at the window, his young face hardened by the night's events. The well's untouched, Thomas reported, returning from his inspection of the property. But they poisoned the horse trough. Lucky the animals were in the pasture. Sarah nodded numbly. Blackwood's men had come just before midnight, a dozen riders with torches and rifles. They hadn't spoken a word, simply opened fire on the barn and outbuildings before circling the property and disappearing back into the darkness. Only James's foresight in posting one of his ranch hands as a lookout had given them enough warning to avoid casualties. Emma approached, her face smudged with soot, but her movement steady. Ma, they left this on the door. She held out a piece of paper that had been nailed to the cabin door. Sarah read the crudely scrawled message. This is just a taste. She crumpled the paper in her fist, looking around at what remained of their improvements. The new fencing torn down, tools broken and scattered, garden trampled. Only the cabin itself had been spared. A calculated decision to ensure they lived to see their losses. How much worse can it get? She whispered. They didn't take lives, James said from the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, his face pale but determined. That means Blackwood still cares about appearances. He wants us to leave voluntarily. Sarah met his gaze, the reality of their situation sinking in. He nearly killed you. Again. But he failed, James replied. Again. Night settled over the damaged homestead. The children had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's work of salvaging what could be saved. Sarah moved quietly through the cabin, a single lamp casting long shadows as she methodically packed a small bag with children's clothes. James watched from the doorway of the bedroom where he'd been resting. "What are you doing?" "I could take the children to my sister in Denver," Sarah said without looking up. "We'd be gone before Blackwood knew we'd left." "Running won't stop him," James replied, his voice gentle but firm. He'll control the valley before you reach the territory line. Sarah's hands stilled on the small dress she was folding. At least my children would be alive. Is that the lesson you want them to teach? That bullies win? Sarah turned to him then, her composure finally cracking. I've already buried a husband. I won't bury my children, too. James moved into the room, wincing slightly as his injured shoulder protested. I understand fear, Sarah. Better than most. Do you? Her voice broke, tears she'd been holding back all day finally spilling down her cheeks. I've lost everything once before. I can't do it again. The lamplight caught the silver in her hair. The streak earned the night her husband died. James wanted to reach for her, but kept his distance, respecting the raw vulnerability she'd never shown before. This morning, he said quietly, I watched Thomas organize the neighbors to salvage the barn timbers. I saw Emma comfort that Whitman woman when she broke down crying over what happened. Your children aren't just surviving, Sarah. They're becoming extraordinary people because of you, not despite what you faced. Sarah touched the wedding ring around her neck, a gesture that had become habitual in moments of doubt. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this fight. You're the strongest person I've ever met, James replied simply. Morning light streamed through the cabin windows, finding Sarah still at the table where she'd spent most of the night, her packed bag nearby. The door opened quietly as Emma entered, carrying a small cup filled with soil. Morning glories, she explained, setting the cup on the windowsill and carefully placing seeds in the dark earth. I saved them from last summer. Sarah watched her daughter's methodical movements. Emma, sometimes we need to know when to let go. Pa didn't raise us to let go, Emma replied, without looking up from her task. Neither did you. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Emma continued planting seeds with careful precision, her small fingers creating perfect little depressions in the soil. This is different, Sarah said finally. Emma looked up then, her young face solemn. Is it? You always say we're stronger together, but now you want to leave Mr. Harrison when he's hurt again because of us. The observation, so plainly stated, caught Sarah off guard. It's not. He needs us, Ma, Emma continued, with a child's direct perception. And we need him. From outside came the sound of hammering. Sarah moved to the window, where Thomas was already at work with several neighbors who had arrived at dawn to help rebuild. James sat on a stump, his arm in a sling, directing the work and occasionally rising to demonstrate a technique despite his injury. Emma placed the cup of seeds where sunlight would warm them. Morning glories can grow anywhere, Ma, even after being stepped on. That's what Pa used to say. They just need something to climb on. Sarah watched as James laughed at something Thomas said, the first time she'd seen her son truly smile in months. Outside, more wagons were arriving, neighbors bringing lumber and supplies. When Sarah heard James preparing to leave later that morning, believing his presence endangered them, she met him at the door. Please, she said simply, stay. By mid-morning, the Collins homestead buzzed with activity. Wagon after wagon had arrived, each bringing modest but crucial supplies: lumber from Farmer Johnson's woodlot, tools from Liam Chen's store, food prepared by the women of Gallatin Springs. What had begun as a neighborly rebuilding effort had transformed into something more profound, a community stand against intimidation. Sarah moved among the workers, distributing water and expressing gratitude to each arrival. The change in her was subtle but unmistakable, a straightening of her shoulders, a newfound resolve in her eyes. She was no longer just defending her family's land, she was becoming a symbol of resistance. Brought what lumber I could spare, Farmer Johnson said, unloading rough-cut planks from his wagon. "Not much, but it'll help." "We're grateful for anything, John," Sarah replied, genuinely moved by his generosity despite his own struggling farm. Eleanor Whitman arrived with her wagon piled high with blankets, preserved food, and medical supplies. "The school board wouldn't approve resources," she explained with a conspiratorial smile, "but these are from my personal supplies." Liam Chen presented a box of quality tools. "My cousin sends these," he said, nodding respectfully to Sarah. "In China, we say, distant relatives cannot compare to close neighbors." The most surprising arrival was Sheriff Hayes, who came without his badge, but with 2 strong sons and a wagon of fencing materials. His presence spoke volumes about where his true loyalties lay when pushed to choose. James coordinated the efforts with quiet authority, assigning tasks based on each person's skills. When he joined Sarah for a brief rest, his expression was thoughtful. "With neighbors like these," he observed, "Blackwood's already lost, whether he knows it or not." Sarah surveyed the transformation taking place, not just of her homestead, but of isolated individuals into a community with shared purpose. "Let's make sure he finds out." Throughout the day, more families arrived, until nearly 20 homesteaders were working side by side to fortify what they now all recognized as the first battleground in their fight for the valley. As evening approached, the day's work began to show remarkable progress. The barn frame stood partially rebuilt, stronger than before. New fencing protected the northern approach to the homestead, and defensive positions had been established at strategic points around the property. James gathered the men near the creek, using a stick to draw in the soft earth. "Blackwood will come from the east," he explained, indicating the likely approach. "The ridge gives him high ground, but also makes his men visible from a distance." Thomas knelt beside him, absorbing every detail. "We should put lookouts here and here," he suggested, pointing to elevated positions that offered good visibility. James nodded, impressed by the boy's tactical thinking. "Good, and we'll position our best shots behind these rocks. Keep low. Use cover. Aim is secondary to staying protected." "But how will I hit anything?" Thomas asked, unconsciously including himself among the defenders. James's expression grew serious. "Survival first. I learned that at Shiloh, the hard way." Thomas looked up in surprise. "You fought in the war?" "Let's just say I learned when to fight and when to wait." James's hand briefly touched an old scar visible at his collar. Nearby, Sarah and Emma worked with Eleanor and several other women, preparing bandages and medicines. Sarah's methodical organization of supplies revealed her preparation for the worst while hoping for the best. "Emma's prepared enough bandages for an army," Sarah commented as she joined the men's planning session. "Let's hope we don't need them," James replied, but his eyes conveyed the reality they both understood. Blood would likely be shed before this conflict ended. As darkness fell, the remaining workers departed with promises to return the next day. Those staying formed a circle around the evening fire, where James outlined their complete strategy, not just for defense, but for documenting Blackwood's illegal activities to present to the territorial authorities. "It's not enough to stop him," James explained. "We need to end his threat permanently." Night had fully descended when a lone rider approached the homestead. Sentries called the alarm, and James and Thomas met the visitor at the edge of the property, rifles ready but not aimed. "Identify yourself," James called into the darkness. "Name's Tucker, Caleb Tucker." The rider's hands remained visible, away from his weapons. "I work for Blackwood. I'm alone." James recognized the man as Blackwood's foreman, always at his employer's right hand during public appearances. "Approach slowly," he ordered, motioning Thomas to maintain his position. The rider came forward into the light cast by the perimeter lanterns. He was a weathered man in his 50s, his expression grim. "I ain't here on Blackwood's orders," he said quietly. "Just the opposite." "Why should we believe you?" Thomas demanded, keeping his rifle steady. Tucker sighed heavily. "Been working for Blackwood 5 years. Never minded tough business, but this—" He shook his head. "Threatening women and children, burning out families. That's not what I signed on for." Sarah had joined them, standing slightly behind James. "What do you want, Mr. Tucker?" "To warn you. Blackwood's brought in extra men from Butte, professional gun hands, not just ranch workers. They're planning to hit at dawn, 2 days from now." James studied the man carefully. "Why are you telling us this?" "My sister lost her farm to Blackwood last year," Tucker replied, his voice bitter. "She took her own life a month later. I should have spoken up then." The simple statement hung in the night air, its authenticity undeniable. "How many men?" James asked after a moment. 20, at least. Well armed." Tucker gathered his reins. "That's all I can tell you. If he suspects I've been here—" Sarah stepped forward impulsively. "You could stay, join us." Tucker shook his head. "Got responsibilities, but I won't ride with them when they come." He tipped his hat and turned his horse. "Good luck. You'll need it." As they watched him disappear into the darkness, Thomas spoke the question they were all thinking. 2 days. Is that enough time?" "It has to be," James replied. The eastern sky had just begun to lighten when Emma spotted the dust cloud rising from the valley floor. She rang the warning bell, 3 sharp peals that sent everyone rushing to their assigned positions. Sarah hurried the youngest children and elderly into the reinforced root cellar, while Thomas distributed ammunition to the defenders crouched behind stone walls and reinforced fence lines. James surveyed their preparations with the calm assessment of a man who had faced battle before. 20 homesteaders, farmers, shopkeepers, and ranchers, armed with hunting rifles and determination, positioned according to the plan they had rehearsed tirelessly for 2 days. Not professional gunmen, but people defending their homes and way of life. "Remember," he called out, "fire only when I give the word. Make every shot count." Sarah took her position at the makeshift medical station they'd established in the summer kitchen, her herbs, bandages, and instruments laid out with methodical precision. Through the window, she could see the approaching riders, at least 20 men, just as Tucker had warned, with Marcus Blackwood's imposing figure at their center. "They're coming straight up the main approach," James noted with grim satisfaction as he joined her briefly. "Just as we hoped." Sarah caught his arm before he could return to his position. "Be careful," she said simply. James covered her hand with his. "You too." The riders halted just beyond rifle range. Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "Harrison, Mrs. Collins, I've come to make one final offer. Leave peacefully now, and no one needs to get hurt." James stepped into view, though still protected by a stone wall. "We're not leaving Blackwood. This land belongs to these people, by law and by right." "I was hoping you'd say that," Blackwood replied, raising his arm in signal. The attackers spurred their horses forward, directly into the trap James had prepared. As they crossed the creek, hidden tripwires sent several horses tumbling, throwing their riders. Simultaneously, defenders opened fire from concealed positions. The battle for Morning Glory Ranch had begun. The first volley caught Blackwood's men by surprise, forcing them to retreat for cover. Two didn't rise from where they fell. Several others dragged themselves away, wounded. The homesteaders had drawn first blood, but the fight was far from over. Inside the summer kitchen, Sarah worked quickly, treating a bullet graze on Farmer Johnson's arm. "Stay down when you go back out," she instructed, tying the bandage with practiced hands. Outside, the attackers had regrouped, spreading out to approach from multiple directions. Sporadic gunfire echoed across the homestead as both sides exchanged shots, more cautious now in their engagement. Thomas proved himself a skilled defender, his youth compensated by steady hands and keen eyes. From his position in the hayloft of the partially rebuilt barn, he picked off a man attempting to flank their eastern defenses. "They're trying to reach the creek bed," he called out in warning. James redirected two defenders to reinforce that position, his battlefield experience evident in his calm, decisive commands. The morning wore on, a deadly stalemate developing as neither side could gain significant advantage. Then, unexpectedly, a figure on horseback broke from the attacker's line, Marcus Blackwood himself, accompanied by 3 men, galloping toward the cabin along a route temporarily unguarded. "Ma!" Emma's warning cry came just as Sarah stepped outside with fresh water for the wounded. Blackwood reined his horse to a stop, his face contorted with rage and frustration. "This ends now," he snarled, leveling his pistol directly at Sarah. James emerged from cover, his own weapon trained on Blackwood. "It's over, Marcus. Sheriff Hayes telegraphed the territorial marshal yesterday. They know everything, the forged deeds, the water rights manipulation, the attacks on legal homesteaders." "You think that matters?" Blackwood laughed harshly. "I own the territorial judge." "Not anymore," came Sheriff Hayes's voice as he stepped from the cabin, badge glinting in the morning sun. "Federal marshals are on their way. I've been gathering evidence for months." Blackwood's hand tightened on his gun, his face revealing the desperation of a man seeing his empire crumble. The moment hung suspended. Blackwood's finger on the trigger, Sarah standing exposed, James ready to fire. Then a small projectile arced through the air, landing at Blackwood's horse's feet. The startled animal reared violently, throwing its rider to the ground. Emma stood at the corner of the cabin, another rock ready in her hand. Blackwood's fall broke the spell. His men, seeing their leader disarmed and surrounded, began throwing down their weapons. Within minutes, the remaining attackers surrendered, their will to fight evaporating with their employer's defeat. Sheriff Hayes and several men bound Blackwood's hands behind his back. "Marcus Blackwood, you're under arrest for attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, and land fraud," Hayes announced formally, newfound authority in his voice. As Blackwood was led away, his once imposing figure now diminished by defeat, he passed close to Sarah. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll regret the day you crossed me." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "The only regret in this valley is that we didn't stand together against you sooner." Around the homestead, neighbors were embracing, tending wounds, marveling at their victory. Thomas stood tall beside James, no longer a boy, but a young man who had defended his home. Emma ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her waist. "We did it, Ma," she whispered. "We did it together." 1 month later, the Collins homestead was transformed. The barn stood complete, fields were being prepared for late planting, and new fencing gleamed in the summer sun. Most remarkably, morning glory vines had begun climbing the porch posts, Emma's seeds taking root and thriving. Sarah stood on the porch, watching James approach from the creek where he'd been working with Thomas on a new irrigation system. The past weeks had seen James divide his time between his own ranch and the Collins homestead, though increasingly his presence at the latter felt permanent. The territorial court made it official, he said, holding up a document. Blackwood's land seizures have been invalidated. The water rights belong to the original homesteaders again. Sarah smiled, a genuine expression that had become more frequent lately. Justice does occasionally prevail, it seems. James hesitated, then reached for her hand. Sarah, I've been thinking about our partnership. Have you? She asked, her expression softening. I was wondering if you might consider making it permanent. He gestured to the thriving homestead around them. Not just the land, us. Sarah's free hand went to the wedding ring she still wore around her neck. After a moment's reflection, she untied the string, removed the ring, and carefully placed it in her pocket. I think, she said, her eyes meeting his, Morning Glory Ranch needs both of us. As the setting sun gilded the valley in gold, James and Sarah stood together on the porch, surrounded by thriving morning glories, symbols of resilience, healing, and new beginnings in the most unexpected of places. Well, friend, we've traveled quite a distance together across the Montana Territory of 1875. If your heart feels a little fuller, and perhaps a touch bruised, from witnessing Sarah's struggle, James's redemption, and the birth of Morning Glory Ranch, know that mine does too. Crafting this tale of resilience and second chances has left me changed in ways I'm still discovering, and I suspect Sarah and James's journey might have stirred something in you as well. There's something about the frontier that strips away pretense and reveals who we truly are when faced with impossible choices. Sarah spent 3 years believing fierce independence was her only protection, convinced that needing others was a weakness she couldn't afford. But true strength, it seems, isn't found in isolation, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to accept help when it's offered, and to stand with others when everything you've built is threatened. What struck me most while writing Sarah's story was how her greatest fear, dependency, ultimately became her salvation. The very connection she resisted brought not weakness, but unprecedented power. James didn't just save her homestead. He helped her discover that interdependence creates a resilience that self-reliance alone never could. Sometimes the help we're most afraid to accept contains exactly the healing we need most. I've been thinking about how this frontier lesson translates to our modern lives. We may not face land barons or fight for water rights, but we all confront moments when pride keeps us isolated in our struggles. The parent who refuses to ask for help, the friend who hides their pain behind a brave face, the neighbor suffering silently rather than admitting need. Sarah's Montana may be long past, but the choice between vulnerability and isolation remains as relevant as tomorrow's sunrise. In the end, Sarah Collins learned what the frontier taught all who survived it. Sometimes a morning glory seed must be buried in darkness before it can climb toward the light. Second chances don't just happen. They're cultivated through courage, trust, and the willingness to believe something beautiful can grow from the ashes of what we've lost. Thank you for walking this trail with me, friend. Stories only truly live when they find hearts willing to ride alongside flawed characters seeking redemption. Your willingness to accompany Sarah from her moment of crisis to that final scene on the porch is what transforms mere words into something that matters. Sarah's story has me reflecting on the walls we build to protect ourselves and how those very defenses can become our prisons. We all face moments when trusting others feels more frightening than standing alone, when accepting help seems more difficult than shouldering impossible burdens by ourselves. Have you ever had to swallow your pride to save something that mattered deeply to you? Or found strength in accepting help when you'd always relied only on yourself? Share your experience in the comments, because true courage deserves recognition, whether it blossomed on a frontier homestead or in your own heart. If Sarah and James's journey of healing and new beginnings resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing. The frontier holds countless stories of people discovering that what they thought were weaknesses were actually the seeds of their greatest strengths, and I'd be honored to share more of them with you. Until next time, may your morning glories bloom even in the most unlikely soil.